2.10 Architecture Repository. Now that we have already explored how Togaf classifies and organizes architecture knowledge through the enterprise continuum, the next logical step is to understand where architecture materials are actually stored, managed, linked, and governed in practice. And that brings us to a very important Togaf concept, which is the architecture repository. Welcome to J.K. Michael's Knowledge Series. The architecture repository is the organized place where an enterprise stores, manages, and links its architecture materials. In simple terms, when an organization does a lot of architecture work, it produces many outputs: models, standards, requirements, governance records, reference materials, and solution views. If these are not stored in a structured way, people cannot find them, reuse them, or govern them properly. So the repository helps the enterprise organize architecture content, manage it consistently, connect related assets, and support reuse and governance. That opening idea is already important for the exam. If you were asked what the architecture repository is, the stronger answer is not that it is just a document folder or a storage drive. The better answer is that it is a structured place for storing, managing, linking, governing, and reusing architecture assets. In other words, it is not only about storage, it is about architecture control and usability. Now let's go deeper into why this repository is needed in the first place. A mature architecture capability produces a large volume of architectural output. That includes principles, standards, models, requirements, reference materials, governance records, and solution views. And as architecture maturity grows, the amount of content grows too. Without a formal structure, those outputs become scattered, duplicated, outdated, or hard to use. That is why the section explains that effective management and leverage of architecture products requires a formal taxonomy, dedicated processes, and tools for architectural content storage. This is where the practical meaning becomes very clear. Architecture maturity creates value, but it also creates volume. And once volume increases, architecture teams can no longer rely on informal storage habits. They need structure. Otherwise, one team may use an old standard, another may recreate a pattern that already exists, and another may not even know which requirement version was approved. So the repository becomes necessary not because architecture is overly formal, but because architecture becomes too important and too extensive to manage loosely. Now that leads us to the first important enabler of a usable repository, which is formal taxonomy. A taxonomy is a structured classification system. In this context, a formal taxonomy helps the enterprise classify different types of architectural assets in a clear and consistent way. Instead of throwing every architecture artifact into one general location, the organization groups assets by type and purpose, such as standards, metamodel content, governance records, requirements, reference materials, architecture views, and solution views. That is what makes the repository usable rather than chaotic. But taxonomy alone is not enough. The section also says the repository needs dedicated processes and tools. That means the repository is not just a storage drive or a document folder. It must be supported by rules for how content is added, governance over updates and approvals, processes for maintaining accuracy, and tools for storing and retrieving content. A real architecture repository must answer practical questions like these: who can add content, who approves changes, how versions are managed, how architects find reusable assets, and how the enterprise knows what is current or obsolete. And this is a very useful exam clue. If a question gives you options that focus only on tools, that is incomplete. If it gives you options that include classification, governance process, and tools together, that is much closer to the real Togaf logic. So remember, a repository becomes effective through classification, process discipline, governance, and tool support together, not through tools alone. Now let's build on that idea. The Togaf standard provides a structural framework for the architecture repository. This means Togaf does not just say, store architecture somewhere. It gives a structured way to organize the repository into major components. That structure helps enterprises distinguish between different kinds of architectural assets that exist at different abstraction levels. And that matters because some content is strategic, some is governance-related, some is reference material, some is requirements-related, and some represents actual architecture or solution landscapes. The repository keeps those different asset types organized and linked. That point is important because learners sometimes imagine the repository as one big container. But Togaf is more disciplined than that. It separates the content into meaningful parts because different kinds of architecture information serve different purposes. Strategy is not the same as governance evidence. Reference material is not the same as approved requirements. Current state views are not the same as solution realization. And the repository structure helps keep all of that clear. Now let's clarify another distinction that is very important for both practice and the exam. The architecture repository is described as one part of the wider enterprise repository. That means the architecture repository is not the whole enterprise knowledge environment. It is one specialized part of a broader enterprise repository landscape. The wider enterprise repository allows architecture assets to be linked to other enterprise repositories, such as detailed design repositories, deployment repositories, and service management repositories. So architecture does not live alone. It must connect to downstream implementation and operational information. That is why the architecture repository helps bridge architecture thinking with design, delivery, and operations. This distinction is one of the places where exam questions can become tricky. A distractor may describe the architecture repository as though it is the whole enterprise knowledge environment. That would be too broad. The correct idea is that it is a specialized architecture-focused repository that sits inside a wider enterprise repository ecosystem. Now we come to the major components of the architecture repository, and these are highly testable, so let's walk through them carefully and in order. The first component is the architecture meta model. The architecture meta model describes the organization's tailored application of an architecture framework, including a meta model for architecture content. A meta model is basically a model of how architecture content is structured. It defines what kinds of architecture elements exist, how they relate, how the organization structures architecture content, and how Togaf has been tailored for that enterprise. In practical terms, it gives order to architecture content so that everyone models and stores things consistently. The second component is the architecture capability. The architecture capability defines the parameters, structures, and processes that support governance of the architecture repository. This is about the organizational ability to run architecture properly. It includes governance arrangements, roles, responsibilities, processes, controls, and management structures. In practical terms, the repository cannot govern itself. The architecture capability provides the people and process framework that keeps it working properly. Now pause there for a moment, because that distinction matters. The architecture meta model is about how architecture content is structured. The architecture capability is about how the architecture function governs and operates that content. One is about content structure. The other is about governance and operating discipline. That is a very important difference to hold clearly for the exam. The third component is the architecture landscape. The architecture landscape presents an architectural representation of assets in use or planned by the enterprise at particular points in time. This means it gives a view of the enterprise architecture as it exists or is planned. A very important detail is that it is time-sensitive. It reflects the architecture landscape at a given point in time. Practically, it helps architects and stakeholders see current state architecture, transition state architecture, future state architecture, and what assets the enterprise is using or planning. The fourth component is the standards library. The standards library captures the standards with which new architectures must comply. This may include industry standards, selected products and services from suppliers, and shared services already deployed. In practical terms, this is where the enterprise keeps the rules and approved standards that new architectures should follow. That supports consistency, governance, compliance, and reduced architectural chaos. And here's another exam distinction that matters a lot. The architectural landscape is about architectural representations of assets in use or planned at points in time, while the standards library is about compliance standards that new architectures must follow. One shows state, the other defines rules. They are not the same thing. The fifth component is the reference library. The reference library provides guidelines, templates, patterns, and other forms of reference material that can be leveraged to accelerate the creation of new architectures. This is about reusable supporting material. Examples include templates, reference models, patterns, guidelines, and reusable examples. In practical terms, architects use this library to avoid starting from scratch every time. The sixth component is the governance repository. The governance repository provides a record of governance activity across the enterprise. That means it stores evidence and records related to architecture governance, such as decisions, approvals, waivers, review outcomes, and governance history. In practical terms, it helps the enterprise track what decisions were made, why they were made, and how governance has been exercised. That means the reference library and the governance repository serve very different purposes. The reference library helps you create faster through reuse. The governance repository helps you trace decisions and governance history. One accelerates architecture creation, the other preserves architectural accountability. That is another useful distinction to hold on to. The seventh component is the Architecture Requirements Repository. This provides a view of all authorized architecture requirements that have been agreed with the Architecture Board. This is where formally approved architecture requirements are held. In practical terms, it gives a controlled source of truth for agreed architecture requirements so teams know what they are working toward. And the eighth component is the solutions landscape. The solutions landscape presents an architectural representation of the solution building blocks, or SBBs, supporting the architecture landscape that have been planned or deployed by the enterprise. This is the solution side view. So if the architecture landscape shows the architecture side view, the solutions landscape shows the planned or deployed solution building blocks that support that architecture. So one is more architectural state-oriented, the other is more realization-oriented. Now that the repository components are clear, let's move into the practical operating logic of how the architecture repository works. First, the enterprise defines the structure of the repository using Togaf's structural framework and classifies the major content areas. Second, through the architecture capability, it defines governance and ownership, including who manages the repository, who approves content, how updates happen, and how quality is controlled. Third, different kinds of content are stored in the right repository components, such as standards in the standards library, templates and patterns in the reference library, requirements in the architecture requirements repository, and governance records in the governance repository. Fourth, the architecture landscape captures current, transition, and target architectural assets. Fifth, the solutions landscape captures the solution building blocks that support the architecture. Sixth, the repository links architecture to wider enterprise repositories like design, deployment, and service management. And seventh, architects and stakeholders use the repository to find reusable assets, check standards, verify requirements, review governance records, and maintain architectural consistency over time. So the logic in one sentence is this: the architecture repository works by organizing architecture content into structured components so it can be governed, reused, linked, and maintained across the enterprise lifecycle. That is the strongest one-line memory anchor for the topic. Now let's make the component view a bit more visual in our minds. The recreated table in the section lays out the major components of the Togaf architecture repository and explains what each one contains and why it matters. The architecture metamodel ensures architecture content is modeled and organized consistently. The architecture capability provides governance and operational control. The architecture landscape shows current, transition, and target architecture views. The standards library supports compliance, consistency, and governance. The reference library accelerates creation through reuse. The governance repository preserves decisions, approvals, and governance history. The architecture requirements repository provides controlled visibility of approved requirements and governance decisions. And the solutions landscape connects architecture to actual or planned solution realization. That table is a very strong revision tool because it helps you connect each repository component to both its function and its value. The conceptual diagram in the section reinforces the same idea. It shows the architecture repository as a structured ecosystem that contains the architecture metamodel, architecture capability, architecture landscape, standards library, reference library, governance repository, architecture requirements repository, and solutions landscape. Some parts define structure, some parts govern, some parts store reusable guidance, some parts record approved requirements and governance decisions, and some parts show the architecture and solution state of the enterprise. That ecosystem view is useful because it stops the repository from feeling like a random list of components. It shows how the pieces work together. Now let's make the whole topic ground in the practical example from the section. Imagine a large telecom company running multiple transformation initiatives: digital onboarding, billing modernization, network automation, and customer analytics. Without an architecture repository, standards are stored in different places, teams create duplicate patterns, governance decisions are hard to trace, requirements get lost, and solution designs drift away from enterprise architecture. But with a structured architecture repository, the standards library tells teams which integration and security standards they must follow. The reference library provides reusable API patterns and architecture templates. The architecture requirements repository stores approved requirements for digital onboarding and analytics. The governance repository records waivers, approvals, and governance review decisions. The architecture landscape shows current and target architecture views across business capabilities and platforms. And the solutions landscape shows which solution building blocks are already deployed or planned. As a result, teams reuse more, architecture becomes easier to govern, design decisions are more consistent, and the enterprise can link architecture thinking to real delivery work. That example is powerful because it shows that the architecture repository is not just administrative storage. It changes what architecture can do in practice. It improves reuse, it improves governance, it improves traceability, and it makes architecture much more usable across a portfolio of change. So let's bring the whole section together clearly. The architecture repository is the structured place for storing and managing architecture assets. It is needed because mature architecture work produces a large volume of output. Effective use of the repository requires a formal taxonomy, dedicated processes, and supporting tools. The Togaf standard provides a structural framework for the repository. The architecture repository is part of the wider enterprise repository. It can link architecture assets to detailed design, deployment, and service management repositories. Its main components include the architecture metamodel, architecture capability, architecture landscape, standards library, reference library, governance repository, architecture requirements repository, and solutions landscape. And the repository supports governance, reuse, traceability, and consistency across the enterprise. And now let's make the exam alignment very explicit because this section is highly testable. A Togaf exam question from this section will often ask you to identify the purpose of the architecture repository, distinguish it from the enterprise continuum, or match repository components to their descriptions. Very testable areas include these. The repository is a structured store and operating framework. It is part of the wider enterprise repository. The standards library stores standards for compliance. The reference library stores reusable guidance and templates. The governance repository stores governance records. The architecture requirements repository stores authorized architecture requirements. And the solutions landscape represents planned or deployed solution building blocks. Those are key exam anchors. And now let's surface the common mistakes because these are exactly where learners often lose marks. One common mistake is confusing the architecture repository with the enterprise continuum. The repository is a structured store and operating framework, while the continuum is a classification view. Another mistake is thinking the repository is just a document folder. Another is mixing up the architecture landscape and the solutions landscape. Another is confusing the standards library with the reference library. Another is forgetting that governance and requirements each have dedicated repository components. And another is assuming the repository is only for architects, when in reality it also supports governance, delivery, and wider enterprise alignment. And finally, here's the practitioner insight that makes the whole topic real. In real projects, architects use the repository as the operational backbone of architecture work. When the repository is weak, problems appear quickly. Teams reinvent patterns, standards are ignored, requirements become inconsistent, governance decisions are forgotten, and nobody knows which architecture view is current. But when the repository is strong, architecture becomes much more usable. Practitioners rely on it to answer practical questions such as, what standards must this project follow? Do we already have a reusable pattern for this? What requirements were formally approved? What did the Architecture Review Board decide last time? And which solutions are already deployed that support this capability? That is why the architecture repository is not just administrative storage. In a mature enterprise, it is a working system for architecture control, reuse, and traceability. And that is exactly why the architecture repository matters. It gives the enterprise a structured, governed, and reusable architecture backbone that connects architecture thinking to real delivery work across the enterprise lifecycle.